Hello, and welcome as we come now to the beginning of certainly one of the most important weeks in the Christian tradition, namely the week which is known as Holy Week. And this weekend, this Sunday, goes by, well, it used to go by two different names. It used to be the second Sunday of the Passion or Palm Sunday. Today, here's one of the connections that they make. It's Palm Sunday of the Lord's Passion. Mainly because there are two scripture readings from the Gospel, both of them, by the way, this time from the Gospel tradition of Luke. The first is from Luke chapter 19, 28 verses through 40. And this tells the story of Jesus' entrance into the city of Jerusalem, which we call Palm Sunday. We'll talk a little bit today about some of the unique characteristics of the Lucan tradition, how he put together the story of Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem and then ultimately his trial, his arrest, trial and execution. The other three readings now for this day, first comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 50, verses 4 through 7, from the letter of Paul to the Philippians, chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, and then from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 14 through chapter 23, verse 56. Also, just as a happens to be the case, this weekend, the first Sunday, or the Sunday of Palm Sunday, is the first day of the Passover of the Jewish community, and it begins Saturday night, as you know, at sundown. That's how the way in which the day is understood in that tradition, and we follow that because that's why we honor the vigil, which already remembers the day. The vigil is the evening before the sunset before. So all of that, let's give a little bit of background. We maybe not be able to do everything today. And just as a little introduction here, it's important to remember, and Luke is of the four evangelists, each, by the way, have their own interpretation, their own portrait of Jesus and the last days of his life. And it's important to notice that each follows their own pattern of what they have been developing throughout the gospel itself and now bring to a conclusion, both with the passion and then next time with the resurrection accounts. Jesus, remember, would be considered to be a very typical Mediterranean male. And the importance of the oldest son is developed in the Lucan tradition. You remember that the early stories, which form in some ways our Christmas time narrations, come from Luke, and it is there that he has brought to our attention, we've noticed this on a number of occasions, the major themes that are important in his story. Jerusalem is one of them, the temple is another, the journey is one. And notice how all of these kind of pattern out as we look at the episodes of this time. What is important is to remember that a young man growing up in the world of Jesus was basically brought up by women, and they were the ones who formed the life background until the young boy reached the age of, maturity, which would be roughly about 12 or 13 years of age. Now, where am I going with this? A little bit that once the boy was now given over to the men, remember, now, I'm not sure just how exactly this worked out in real life, but nevertheless, this is the pattern that was done. Jesus is at, when he was 12 or 13, at the age of puberty, had to learn, and this is the point that we're kind of looking at, how to become a man. He had to have the ability to bear physical punishment and pain without flinching or crying. See, so this was the thing that now, before that, it would have been all right because women, no offense here, would have accepted that. But now he must be all man, okay? And when one reads in the book of Sirach, remember one of those books produced in the Hebrew tradition, probably about 200 or less years before Jesus' time, the book of Sirach says, and I'll just give you this so that you can get some sense of what was the background that a young man, particularly the firstborn, had to undergo. In the book of Sirach, in chapter 31, it says, "He who loves his son will whip him often." So now this may come as a kind of a surprise to us. Also in the book of Sirach, he says, "Beat his ribs while he is young, or else he will become stubborn and disobey you." So in some ways, the use of physical violence to the young man as he moved from this earliest days of puberty to manhood involved taking kind of punishment, if you want, without while controlling it. Now, why do I mention this? Because when one looks at the gospel tradition according to Luke, one notices that one of the ways in which he portrays Jesus is a person who takes things in stride and, by the way, is not retaliatory either. It's important to notice that you learn how to take this suffering, if you want, in stride, without breaking down or without violent reaction either. So all of that's just a little bit of a background to which all of the, certainly, gospel writers were aware of, but that Luke in a special way seems to develop. All right, let's just do a couple of thoughts as Jesus enters the city of Jerusalem. Up to this time, one remembers in the gospel, and we will notice this more regularly as the Lucan year unfolds before us, Jesus is on a journey from the Galilee to Jerusalem, and he is pictured as a pilgrim. That is, he is pictured as leading his disciples, and they speak of going up to Jerusalem in the traditional way. Now, here's where maybe some changes happen as we look at the story this time. Jesus, first of all, and you can break this down into two sections, namely the section of Jesus' entrance in Jerusalem. He sends his disciples ahead to obtain a colt. We're not quite so sure just who Jesus knew there. And then, so there's the story of the colt, and then there's the story of Jesus' entrance into the city. Jesus, now, the colt. Most of the time, and I would certainly not disagree with this, the colt is pictured as a donkey or a mule. Therefore, these would be animals of the field, of burden, of the ordinary person. It would not be a horse. And there is some story that at this particular time of the year, which would be the Passover time of the year, that from one of the gates of the city of Jerusalem would be entering Pilate, because he came up from Caesarea Philippi, where he had, or Maritima rather, where he had been stationed, and would enter the city of Jerusalem in order to maintain order if there were any problems that arose during the Passover time, because remember that Passover quadrupled the population of the city of Jerusalem. From another gate would enter Jesus. Now, here, if he were a pilgrim, he would simply walk in, okay? fact that he rides on an animal, a colt. Now, tradition says that the colt was a donkey or a mule. It doesn't really say what a colt is. The point is that the animal had not been ridden before. This is the first time. And so when Jesus enters riding the colt, he is coming as king. And that is perhaps certainly important. We know that the kingship of Jesus is going to be very different, is taught very much, lived very differently than the power structures of the time. And Jesus is greeted as he enters the city of Jerusalem. Now, who does he come with? Well, he comes with those who he has been leading, the disciples and others who have been following him. Included in this category of persons are also, we believe, women. There's an enthusiasm caused by the disciples that disturbed the leadership, particularly the Pharisees. And Jesus enters the city as a prophet might, okay? And that they greet him, and Jesus is asked by the Pharisees, why are they doing this? Stop this. And Jesus says, well, if the people were silent, then even the very stones would cry out at the entrance here, okay? So Jesus is greeted enthusiastically, and to show his kingship, by the way, they throw down their cloaks, so that this would be something that you would do for royalty or for a king. In this gospel, they're not palms, sorry, but they're the cloaks, okay? It's another gospel that develops that theory, which, of course, honors the day that we call the Sunday of the Palms. All right, so Jesus enters the city of Jerusalem, is greeted, and is challenged by the leadership, by the Pharisees, and that kind of ends it. Now, this is, as I mentioned, in chapter 19. What we will be listening to in the major reading of the day begins in chapter 22. So keep in mind that much of what happens after Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem, some of it we have looked at, and some of it we will look at more readily as the year unfolds. But one point that Jesus does make is that in chapter 19, verses 41 to 44, Jesus weeps over the city of Jerusalem. So he is pictured as saying, now has a new king entered, now has a new opportunity for the Jerusalemites to honor God, and there's going to be a refusal of that. And Jesus is pictured as weeping. Now there's a number of other things that happen. Jesus cleanses the temple, etc. But that's for other times that we have looked at. Anyway, we celebrate the entrance of Jesus, greeted as, and this is interesting, greeted as a king. All right, the gospel begins this time with a description of the Last Supper. Jesus is pictured there with the apostles. Luke calls it a Passover. And then there are now some, what I want to kind of illustrate a little bit with the times that we have here are the differences that the Lucan tradition of the passion and death of Jesus introduces. First of all, of the four of them, this is the longest, so there's more information found in Lucan's account than in the others, just as kind of information for Jeopardy when you need to have to know what's the longest of the passion narratives. Now, also, the way in which, and will have to read this, is there's a blessing of a cup, There's a blessing of bread, and there's a blessing of a cup again. So this is a description of the supper that is a little different than that found in Matthew and Mark. In fact, if there is some connection here, the Lucan account seems to be connected with an account of the Last Supper found in a letter of Paul. The first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 11 has a similar kind of description of what happened at the Last Supper. So there are two, what we would call, parallel accounts here. At Luke's story, the betrayer is at the table. The words that we hear are, of course, very familiar. This is the cup of the new covenant, etc. So we can read and remember all of that. When the supper now, or at the supper rather, in this gospel, they begin a discussion as to who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, okay? And so we get a little bit of the dialogue of what went on at the supper. We know that, by the way, Judas has made a decision. This has been a prologue to the meal to betray Jesus. Satan has entered into him. One might remember that in the beginning of this gospel, when Jesus had been tested in the desert and had defeated, remember the three challenges that Satan had given to Jesus had triumphed. He had triumphed over him. Satan had left him to come back another time. So now in Luke's story, this is the opportunity where Satan returns, enters into Judas to get him to do what we know he did, a betrayal. All right. Now Jesus then says, well, all of you tonight will also betray me. No, they say, even though everyone else would, not me. And again, a characteristic of Lucan tradition is the importance of Peter. And Jesus says, Simon, Simon, Satan will enter into you, but I have prayed that you, on your own, after you have failed, will receive the strength to bring your brothers back together again. So it's important to notice that in the Lucan tradition, there's great honor to Peter and the importance of his road. Jesus now tells them that, remember before he said, don't go without a money bag, a sack, or sandals, and eat anything. Now he says, take a money bag with you. And if you need a sword, sell your cloak to get one. Now this is interesting a little bit. Again, what we're looking at the differences. All right. There are four major sections, just to kind of give a little background here, in the Passion narrative that Luke has. The first, as we have looked at, is there's a conspiracy, a betrayal, and the Passover meal. Okay. The second section pictures Jesus as being in the garden. That is all part of one. That is the Mount of Olives. Then there, secondly, will be a hearing before the Jewish council. Thirdly will be the Roman trial. And fourth will be the crucifixion and death of Jesus. So, after the supper, they go to the Mount of Olives. It is there, of course, that we have the famous scene of Jesus praying, and keep in mind that it's very important in this tradition that before anything significant happens, Jesus prays. Now, in the garden, in Luke's viewpoint here, Jesus continues to keep control of things, but he prays so importantly and so deeply that his sweat becomes like drops of blood. Now that's one of the unique characteristics of this gospel, namely that Jesus' passion or prayer in the garden reflects that. Now, like drops of blood does not necessarily mean they were, but different artists, of course, have portrayed this as actual shedding of blood. So the agony in the garden, a point that one wants to make out here is that Jesus went there as was his custom. And so that would indicate that Judas knew where Jesus was and therefore would be able to lead those who were going to arrest him. As I mentioned, Luke does not dwell on the emotional distress of Jesus, but rather on the importance of his prayer. Now he is arrested by Judas. Here again, this follows pretty much the traditional pattern that one finds in Matthew and Mark. But the interesting thing here is that Peter draws a sword and goes after one of the servants, chops off his ear, and Jesus is pictured as healing the man's ear. Now, there's no name given. There's another gospel where this is done, but here Jesus, again, remember throughout this gospel, Jesus is pictured as the healer, but always being very concerned about others, even amidst his own difficulty. All right. He is arrested. He is brought before the tribunal. Now, in this gospel, Peter is, again, will, as the others point out, will deny Jesus, that he knows him 3 times. But, and you can look at that episode, which is similar to the others. What I want to say here is kind of characteristics that are unique. That as Jesus is brought before Pilate, in this gospel, Pilate, more so perhaps than in the others, that is in Matthew and Mark, tries to save Jesus, okay? And in fact, it is so constructed that 3 times he seems to do this. Jesus is accused, and it's important to notice here, on political issues, okay? I know we kind of see this as spiritual, and we say, that religion and politics don't mix, but that's exactly the reason why Jesus is brought before Pilate. Why? Because he has broken a relationship. He's trying to say those who bring him before Pilate, he is perverting the nation, he is forbidding the paying of taxes to the emperor, and he himself is claiming to be Messiah and King. Now, those latter 2, namely that he says don't pay the taxes and that he's making himself out to be the king, are false. Thank goodness we don't have fake news today, but here it is. They have made this up. So, Pilate is not convinced, as we hear, by the argument that is made. And here is what is a unique addition into this story. Pilate, when he hears that Jesus comes from the territory of the Galilee, and he knows that that's headed by Herod, and he knows that Herod happens to be in town because it is the Passover, sends Jesus to Herod, hoping that Herod will make the decision that will end Jesus and therefore take the case out of Pilate's hands. Now, as you know, throughout this gospel, Herod has been wanting to see Jesus. Now he does. Read this little episode. Herod wants Jesus to do a miracle, to make a sign, Jesus refuses to play that game. Herod finds, kind of takes off his clothes, puts his clothes on, cloaks that is, and sends him back to Pilate without making any kind of decision that Jesus ought to die. So you can, this is a thwarting of Pilate because therefore Herod has found Jesus innocent. And it's important to notice that the kind of image that is being developed in this Passion narrative is that Jesus is the innocent victim, that Jesus is a martyr, that he has stood the course of his tradition, of his belief, like a man, as we mentioned earlier on, and his innocence is continually brought out, more so perhaps than in any of the other Gospels. In this story, we are introduced to Barnabas. Now, what's important here, that in this story, it is noted that Barnabas had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. So notice that it's a political reason why insurrection, of course, murder would be something else. All right, so just that little bit of background about Barabbas, that we hear. He represents violence, murder, sedition, and the very opposite of what Jesus stands for and stood for. Pilate now makes, so he has tried to get out of it by using Herod, by using Barabbas, but none of that works. He now makes a third and last attempt, and against his better judgment, because the crowds are kind of moving in, condemns Jesus to death. On the way, just to kind of add a couple quick things, he meets Simon the Cyrene, who in many ways is a model of discipleship, because remember earlier on that if you wanted to be a follower of me, you must take up your cross and follow me. So in a certain way, Simon is the model disciple. All right, when we come to the crucifixion scene, Jesus is crucified and pointed out that they're between two criminals, one on his left and one on his right. On the way, by the way, to the cross, Jesus had spoken to women. This is a unique section of Luke's story, and he sympathizes with them, and there's a prediction of the fall of Jerusalem. Again, that needs to be expanded perhaps a little bit more. Now, when Jesus is placed on the cross, you get the famous dialogue between the two thieves. One says, after all, and Jesus is challenged by the leaders, and he saved others, etc., etc. But now you get the one man hanging with Jesus says, well, in effect, why don't you save us, save others? The other says, no, we are suffering justly for what we deserve. This man is, and here's the point, this man is innocent. And he says to Jesus, forgive me. And Jesus says, this day you will be with me in paradise. Now it's true to say that the words of Jesus seem to be addressed only to the whom we call the good thief, but just maybe the fact that you will be with me in paradise is the forgiveness of Jesus extended to all. And that's one thought that isn't often reflected here, that the compassion of Jesus encompasses all. So maybe the other thief on the other side is also going to be brought into the paradise experience. Don't know, just the thought when we think of the universality that is certainly a characteristic of Luke and of Jesus' compassion. Jesus dies on the cross, saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they have do. He gives up his spirit. Jesus is, in a sense, really in control. And after his death, the mention that there are women present there who had followed him, something else that perhaps we could develop a little bit further. And the soldier speaks as Jesus has died on the cross. Truly, this man was innocent. So keep in mind, what I've tried to quickly suggest is that the martyr Jesus stays the experience of the cross faithfully, and in the end reflects his traditional belief in the graciousness of God's mercy and compassion. There's much more to say here, but for now, thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.